Welcome to the Feminist Research Speaker Series. My name is Domale Dube. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Alberta. I'm also the interim director of the Institute for Intersectionality Studies. I want to welcome you on behalf of IIS and Women's and Gender Studies Department, the two sponsors of this talk. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement, and I want to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. We are pleased to have Dr. Tracey Nicholls here with us. And Dr. Nicholls is going to give us, a talk on online misogyny. And I want to invite you to hold your questions until the end. Feel free to type them in the chat if you feel like you're going to forget them. So just know that we will have a Q&A shortly after Dr. Nicholls' talk. And now I want to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Chloe Taylor, who is a professor in Women's and Gender Studies here at the University of Alberta, to introduce our speaker for the afternoon.
Thank you, Domale. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tracey Nicholls today, whom I've known since we were both new graduate students at McGill over 20 years ago. So following her PhD at McGill, Dr. Nichols's first tenure-track faculty position was in the philosophy department at Lewis University in the Chicago area, where she was also co-director of the Women's Studies program. While at Lewis, Dr. Nicholls published her first 3 books, a co-edited volume on Frantz Fanon and the Decolonization of Philosophy, published in 2010, a second co-edited volume, I Don't See Color, Personal and Critical Perspectives on White Privilege, published by Penn State University Press in 2015, and a monograph titled An Ethics of Improvisation, Aesthetic Possibilities for a Political Future, published in 2012, which draws on feminist standpoint theory and critical race theory to explore the ethical, political, and aesthetic interdependencies in improvised free jazz. Dr. Nicholls was also the co-creator and faculty mentor for Voices, a student movement to build an anti-rape campus culture at Lewis during her tenure there. After being promoted to associate professor at Lewis, Dr. Nicholls took an associate professor position in the Graduate School of International Peace Studies at Soka University in Japan from 2018 to 2020, and was then senior lecturer and then associate professor in politics and international relations at Massey University in New Zealand between 2020 and 2024. While at Massey, Dr. Nicholls published her second monograph, Dismantling Rape Culture, The Peace-Building Power of Me Too, published by Routledge in 2021. Dismantling Rape Culture uses peace studies conceptions of structural and cultural violence to analyze the culture of exploitation and impunity that Me Too was criticizing, and positioned the significance of Me Too movements as a politics of care, empathy, and empowerment. Over her career, Dr. Nicholls has also published dozens of book chapters and journal articles. Since 2024, Dr. Nicholls has been the co-principal investigator and project manager on a research project that centers women's experiences of online misogyny, public harassment, and bullying. This interdisciplinary feminist research collaboration is the recipient of a prestigious 3-year grant from the Marsden Fund of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and is what Dr. Nicholls will be speaking to us about today. So with that, I will hand it over to Tracey.
Thank you, Chloe, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to give this talk today, in part because, as I was saying earlier, before some of you may have joined, we're at about a midpoint of the research project. It's a 3-year project that wraps up in June 2027. So putting together this presentation and really pulling together the work that the team has been doing and the way that my thinking has emerged has actually been a really valuable midpoint check-in with how we're doing. So I'm really excited to be able to bring you a bit of an overview of what the research is that we've been doing and what it's been doing in terms of my thinking on on this particular facet of violence against women and girls. So, okay. So you should be able to see the initial slide, title slide. Yeah,
Yes.
great. Okay. All right. So I'd like to introduce my team. So the project that that has been funded, that I am the project director and co-PI for, is about misogyny, rhetorical violence, and this idea that we talk about as invisibilized entwining of digital and embodied social worlds. So sort of the very first question that we got to in pulling together our application for this funding was the very first thing we sort of wrestled with was this idea that, well, the digital online world is a different sort of thing than our actual embodied social worlds, and the harms that happen online are a different sphere than the harms that happen in an embodied space. And so that was something we knew from the beginning that we really wanted to push back against. So what we've been looking at doing is, how do we actually make visible these connections between online experiences and embodied effects? So we got funding from the Royal Society of New Zealand, Te Aparangi, and the Marsden Fund that is funding this research is specifically looking for blue skies projects. So really pushing the boundaries of what we know now and looking at, sort of, what are we not looking at? What are we not thinking about? So the terms of reference of our project, if you like, are to develop creative research methods that will explore these interconnections between digital, online, and embodied experiences. So things that will reveal this entwining that we believe is taking place. So research methods that actually look at how online misogyny lands in the body or hits the body. And we also are looking to contribute to a more sophisticated theoretical understanding of misogyny. So very much working with Kate Mann's definition that some of you may be familiar with, the work that she's done distinguishing sexism and misogyny. So what we want to do is, again, in the contribution, in the sort of the theoretical contribution that we are starting with, is this idea that my co-PI Suze Wilson came up with, as the idea that misogyny, women's embodied experience of misogyny, is like being trapped in a glass cage. And so Suze is working here from the idea of the glass ceiling and the glass cliff, which you might be familiar with, ways in which women are structurally set up to fail without making it really obvious that that's what's going on. So really sort of concealing the structural mechanisms. So this is where we started at the beginning of 2024, is with funding to do these two things. And so what we have been doing, again, as I said, working with building on Mann's definition of misogyny as policing, the idea that misogyny is the law enforcement that keeps women in line, that keeps us compliant and keeps us oriented to what men need. And so the idea is that caging is really part of enforcement, part of the whole policing, a way of putting people who have stepped out of line back into a space, putting them into a space where their freedom is curtailed, right? So putting them into a cage. And again, I have on the slide this idea of putting people ? And I'm going to talk about this later in terms of my thinking about the background of the cage, because part of what I'm thinking is that it's very clearly, once we get to this whole idea of the glass cage, it's very clearly not something that is being done to people who are being recognized as fully human, right? So there's I want to argue that there is a dehumanization element in the caging from the very beginning. But I think the real value of looking at the idea of misogyny as a glass cage is it really does conceptualize the women's experience of it. So the idea of walking or being surrounded by a glass cage is you can see the sides of it. You feel the constraints of being in an enclosed space, but because it's glass, other people don't actually see what's holding you back. They just see this woman who doesn't seem to be moving, doesn't seem to be responding as a free choosing acting agent. So there's a sense in which what the cage does for observers is it mystifies the women's behavior and actually presents these women as less agentic than they really are. So I think all of that is really valuable, really valuable insight to start sort of putting into some sort of visible, publicly accessible packaging, which is essentially what we've been doing in the project through the work we've been doing in turning our research data into an art exhibit. So I'm going to start with the art exhibit of the glass cage and then work back to the research data that it's coming from. But so what we've done is we've been working with an artist curator who has come up with this design of these 3 different cages that have, each of them have 7, they're glass in scare quotes. They're actually perspex just because that's safer and easier to handle. So there's 7 panels that have etching on them or printing on them. And each of the cages is actually shaped like an octagon. So there's 7 panels, and then there's an empty panel that you can actually walk right into. And so you can, in the walking through of the exhibit, actually walk into each of the cages and read the quotes from women that we've been interviewing about their experiences of online misogyny. And so when you're inside, you see this kind of thing. You see the text that's actually describing a particular reaction to online misogyny. But if you're standing outside the cage, you don't actually see the writing. It's just gibberish, right? So again, really gets at the experience versus what the outsider is seeing as the experience. And so when we've been talking about turning this interview data into glass cages that we could exhibit, I had understood all the way through these conversations that we were going to, in the exhibit, get this really cool inside the cage, outside the cage effect. What I did not expect when we set it up, the first gallery showing that we had, we set it up in a way, we set it up in this space that actually this drawing here, this artist drawing is actually of the first exhibit. So it has the notation of the front window of the gallery space that we set up in. And so there was light streaming through the window as we were setting up these cages. And we realized that actually what we were also seeing is reflection of the text through the cage, onto the walls and the floors, and in the case of this picture, onto me. So So that's my, you can see the shadowy figure in the background taking the picture. That's my sister-in-law who attended the launch party that we had. And so she took that picture of me that has the text projected on it. And that reflection element, that added yet another layer, at least for me, in thinking about how to represent online misogyny. Because as I said, I'd been keenly aware that we were going to get the inside the cage, outside the cage experience of the text, but I hadn't thought about reflection. And it wasn't until we were doing that setup that I was like, and this is a representation of the object lesson that online misogyny actually imparts to the daughters, the sisters, the friends, all of the people who are observing this particular woman be attacked, right? It's not necessarily gibberish for them. They're seeing the message very clearly. They're also seeing that it's not directed at them, right? They're not caught up in it. They are just, again, being policed at a distance, right? So the so the art exhibit that we had, I want to talk a little bit about the data that we drew from. So we've been doing interviews in this project with women in New Zealand who are exhibiting leadership in academia, journalism, and politics. So basically areas where women are, or okay, let me back up a little bit. Areas where people who are occupying those roles are expected to be experts and expected to be authoritative and expected to be able to understand and explain what is going on in our world. And my co-PI, Suze, she had some very interesting things to say about the idea of women. One of the presentations she's been giving is about women engaged in leadership. And how leadership is inherently coded to us in this as exhibiting virtues that are the kinds of virtues we expect from men. So when we are in when women are exhibiting leadership, they are exhibiting masculine traits. And that's good for them as leaders, but it's bad for them as women in exactly the way that man discusses the policing of women to make sure that they're exhibiting empathy and they're exhibiting feminine coded goods. And actually, it has just occurred to me that I skipped over something I really, really wanted to do at the beginning. So if you will bear with me, I'm just going to skip back through my slides because I leapt into the Blue Sky funding without actually introducing my team, who are absolutely invaluable in, like, none of us separately would have been able to pull together any of the things that we have been doing. So I put their pictures there with the intention that I would go through and do a little introduction of all of us. So bear with me, I'm going to do that now. So Chloe has very generously introduced me and my background in political theory, philosophy, and violence against women. This is my co-PI, Suze, who is an expert in leadership studies and is really coming at misogyny through leadership studies. So this is the deep thinking she's been doing about the double bind that women in leadership find themselves in, because if they are good leaders, they are by definition not good women, and of course vice versa. And Suze does a lot of her work, at least recently, looking at the case study of our most recent female prime minister, Jacinda Ardern, who is notable for being one of the very few women who has ever occupied a leadership role of a country and given birth while in office. So very much the, wrestling constantly with the being a woman who is also recognized as a strong and effective leader. So that's Suze's work. And she is the one who has come up with this glass cage concept that has really, really pulled together so much of our thinking. This is one of our associate investigators, Dr. Sarah Riley, who is a critical health psychologist, and she is really our creative methods guru. So she has actually done a lot of work in sort of developing the particular research methods that are going to collect this data that's going to break open the mystified entwining of digital and embodied spaces. And shout out to Sarah. She also had the amazing forethought about 20 odd years ago to marry the man who is our artistic curator. So yeah, she's bringing a lot to the team. And this is our Indigenous researcher scholar, Dr. Rochelle Stewart Withers, whose background is in Indigenous and international development through sport. But her great contribution to this project, she's working right now on taking the lead on a paper on feminist data sovereignty. So what we need to do to really fully own our own data. And that will be published as part of the project, but she is also our ethics guru. And as you can imagine, getting ethics approval to do research in an online misogyny space, there's an awful lot of thinking that has to be done about how to protect participants, how to protect data. And so yeah, we are all bringing skills to this project that make it possible in ways that it wouldn't have if it were any of our if any of us were doing this as a singular research project. So back to where I left off. So we've been doing these interviews with women exhibiting leadership, and what these cages that we have set up as part of our art exhibit, they come really the cages have sort of three separate themes to them. So the first cage is really looking at the kinds of threats that women get. And this is an uncomfortable part of the project for us because there is a sense in which really just repeating the kinds of threats that women get, it has the potential to be polluting of our minds and souls and discourses. But it also has this sort of disaster porn quality to it. But so there's a sense in which we don't want to highlight just here's what women are receiving, but it is really important to give people a sense of some of what counts as online misogyny, some of what is being received in the online misogyny space, in particular because there is an element that all of our interviewees have articulated to some extent in their own various spheres of influence. So for instance, the journalists. It is part of the world of journalism that you are expected to have a thick skin, and people are going to criticize your stories. It's the same in academia with research and with our scholarship, and the same thing in politics with putting forward policies. So there's this idea that, you're supposed to be able to withstand a certain amount of rough and tumble. And so when people actually say, hey, I'm being harassed or being threatened, there is a sense, and this is really, kind of calling on all of that snowflake discourse that at least in my it has been on my radar at least since about 2016, this sort of real disparagement of people for being weak because they cannot tolerate what is being presented or what is being understood by people who use the sort of the snowflake language as, oh, this is just what you should expect, and you're not tough enough to deal with it. So it is necessary to say something about the kind of abuse that women get, to make it clear that these are not people who are like upset because somebody didn't like my story, or upset because somebody gave me a negative review, right? These are people who are doing their jobs in the face of just absolutely violent and vile attempts to intimidate them, attempts to drive them out of leadership. And in particular, I want to hone in on this quote from Charmaine. This is the one that my sister-in-law was taking the picture of me, of it reflected on my clothing. So Charmaine shared this observation about this one time she had someone engage in abuse of her. He told me he was going to kill me and what he was going to do, and he knew where I lived. So, wow, terrifying to know that somebody who says they want to kill you actually knows where you live. And the thing is, you can think about, certainly there are cases where it's never okay to threaten to kill someone, but there are circumstances where you might be able to imagine someone who is so overwrought that seems like an acceptable thing to say. But here's part of what's going on in online misogyny. Something I'm going to talk about a couple of slides from now is this notion of the extremist quality of the abuse. And this particular, he told me he was going to kill me. This woman is a mayor of a small town in New Zealand, and the person who threatened to kill her and told her what he was going to do and that he knew where she lived was upset because she put in parking meters. Like, that is the level of disjunction between what the woman is doing wrong and what the response is. And I think it's really important that people actually understand that there is no proportionality between the action the woman is taking that is being policed, if you like, and the actual level of horrific abuse that she's receiving. So cage one, it's very important to give people a sense of what exactly the threats are and what exactly the abuse is. And then the second cage is really foregrounding what women have to say about embodiment, about how this affects them in their bodies. And I, in this one, particularly appreciate the observation that Claire made, because she talks about this idea of, it feels like you've been slapped, but there's nothing physical there. And so you have this recoil effect, but you're reacting, your mind, as this is happening, your mind is sort of going, but I'm reacting to nothing. That doesn't make sense. And so there's this disconnect in the processing of the abuse that has just been thrown at you. And I think also the idea of having to live, as Diana does, in a constant state of vigilance, right? These kinds of embodiment data. This is the really, really valuable stuff that we have been picking up in these interviews that we've been doing. And I want to wrap up this slide just by touching on this this comment in the cage 3, the response strategies or the coping and resistance pushback effects. So one of the interviews we did, we've been doing paired interviews. So we've been reaching out to, say, a woman journalist who is willing to speak to us. And we've been saying, hey, do you have somebody else, a colleague of yours that you'd like to interview with? So we did a paired interview with Cheryl and Diana, 2 journalists. And so we started off this interview, we did our little, pre-interview setup explanation thing. And then we started off with, so give us a sense of like what you've experienced. And Diana started out by talking about she was deeply, centrally involved in a really, really highly regarded documentary that was released about 3-4 years ago, and really, really caught a lot of attention at the time. And the attention it heaped on her was death threats on her and her family, such that her opening story in our interview was about the time that the media company who had commissioned the documentary had to put her and her family in a safe house because literally they were not safe at home. And so we had this whole interview with Cheryl and Diana where both of them were giving us sort of horrific incident after horrific incident. And then we got to the wrap up and sort of asked, so is there anything that you thought we might talk about that we haven't asked you? Is there anything that you feel is unsaid? And that's when Diana came out with, well, I've talked a lot about the negative things that people say, but I want to say something about the positive things, right? Because, and she talked about it in such, like just with such like really deep passion and gratitude, how important it is to hear from people who say, good work, keep going, thank you for that, right? So really acknowledging not just the achievement that she had, not just what she's contributed, but acknowledging that with an awareness of what it is costing her. And so that kind of gratitude, that kind of thing that in a recent piece of writing, I talked about as networked affirmation that can counter networked online misogyny. I now think maybe I was a little optimistic in that piece, but I do think that one of the responses, one of the things that individuals in the here and now can do in response to online misogyny is to get in touch with the woman who is being attacked, right? To, just be a voice in the inbox or the DMs that is, hey, I like what you do. I'm glad you're doing it, right? That is something that has been identified as enormously important. So, as we've been going through collecting all of this data and thinking about what this means and how to package it, I've really been sort of running 2 different questions as we've been going through this. So, thinking about the fact that we've been working centrally with Kate Mann's definition of misogyny as policing. And there's some interesting viewpoints and arguments emerging in the literature, in the scholarship around online misogyny, that's really making an argument that there is a different quality, a different texture to online misogyny. There is something more. Online, it's not just misogyny on the screen. It's misogyny on the screen, but amplified, ramped up in some ways. And so I've been thinking about what limitations we might be facing without possibly even being aware of them if we if we start our research on online misogyny just from a definition of misogyny by itself, what are we failing to capture, perhaps, if we're not looking at a specifically online definition? And I've also been thinking about this idea of, the glass cage concept that Suze came up with. I've been thinking about it in terms of what motivates this? What makes putting people in cages or putting women in cages, what makes that seem like something that people would want to be doing, right? Like, what's the point of this? How is it being done? Why is it being done? So I think the things that I see, both in the interview data we've been accumulating and in the in the literature review that I've been pulling together for the team, networked misogyny has been identified. Like, networking has been identified as a thing that makes online misogyny different in character from sort of the offline stuff. And so again, Diana in our interviews pointed out, sort of laid out here's how it happens. It's not just that somebody actually sends me an email saying, your story sucked and you're a terrible person, right? It's like, it comes into my email box. It comes into my boss's email box. It comes into my colleagues' email boxes, right? It's everywhere, and you just can't get away from it. And again, I think this is somewhat related to what we're seeing with, kids and bullying over social media, right? There is a sense in which one of the, back in the old days when I was being bullied offline at school, I would go home from school and it would all be over until the next day. But there's no over till the next day if it's happening on your phone and you're living on your device, as so many of us are these days. So there is a sort of a strategic piling on or mobbing that is happening, that makes online misogyny different from, or a more intense version perhaps than of this organized hatred against women. And there is also there is a more unsettling language, right? So this is, there's an Australian media theorist, Emma Jane, who has done a lot of work on this. She's probably one of the early theorists. She's been writing about online misogyny since at least 2014. So one of sort of the very early voices in this conversation. And she had earlier on started to refer to online misogyny as e-bile, but has more recently settled on the idea of rape-glish, to really, really name and point out to us that this normalization of rape threats is really one of the central common features of online misogyny. And so there is this sense in which, people think, often people who have not experienced an online attack tend to think about this as, it's just words on a screen. You put your phone down and walk away. You close your laptop. What's the big deal? But, we are so effectively entwined with our online lives these days that words on a screen are words that matter, and they are words that can affect us. So this is something that really is getting to our emotions in a different way than, something like words on a page, right? And so there are, I think, some really important distinctions to be made. There are things that that are present in online misogyny that we wouldn't necessarily get in our offline lives, right? So part of the story here is the technological affordances. And so if it's different, then I think we need to actually start thinking about why and how online misogyny is differing from our embodied experiences of it. And so, one of the things that has been in the background of my thinking all the way through this project, a few years before I got involved with the project, I'd read this book by Silvia Federici, Caliban and the Witch. And it's one of those books that just really explained things to me. Like it's a book that has lived inside my head since I read it. And so what the central thing that Federici is talking about is this early modern period in Europe where one of the things that was going on is there was a system, there were many systematic campaigns of terror aimed at women who were being accused of witchcraft. And, you know, I'd grown up with this very benign idea of witches, you know, Samantha Stevens and Bewitched. And I'd known about the Salem witch trials. And I'd also even known that the witch hunts were about more than like, you know, a half a dozen women in a small town in Massachusetts. And it wasn't until I read Caliban and the Witch that I actually realized the scale of it. You know, hundreds of thousands of women who were, you know, sort of burned, drowned, tortured in various other ways. So I realized the scope of it. And I think also I find Federici very persuasive in her argument that you need to see this as a counter-revolution of the power structure against the peasants who had emerged from a feudalist system or were emerging and were actually managing to maintain some autonomy in their everyday lives, right? There were at this sort of in the sort of 1300s, you know, there was still this phenomenon in many countries of Europe of common hunting lands, rights to fish in the river. And so the enclosure movements that turned land into property that some people owned and could control everybody else's access to. This is sort of the enclosure movements that took the commons away from people and made it really very, very difficult for people to live what we would now call off the grid, right? So this was a way of taking away people's ability to sustain their own existence such that men would be forced to have to work for a wage and women would be economically dependent on men. So what we see as the point of these witch hunts, these campaigns of terror, is to gender public space as men's domain and to make it really next to impossible for a woman to say, no, I don't want to get married. I'd like to have my own business and just live by myself and support myself. Right. So there's a sense in which Federici's argument is that what we see is a primitive accumulation of women. We see women becoming household wealth, right? A man marries a wife and then he has a servant and he has someone to provide him with children and someone to take care of the children. And that's what makes it possible for him to be the wage slave. And so there is a sense in which one of the ways to understand Federici's argument is that she's tracing this way that women who were never in a gender equal environment nonetheless became more objectified and more commodified and more property than person. And so what we see then is these witch hunts are campaigns that target some women, destroy them as a quite deliberately and intentionally as an object lesson to these other women about what will happen if they step out of line. So these other women who are learning this object lesson are basically then subsequently being policed in the way that Mann's definition describes, right? Their behavior is being monitored to make sure that they're being good women, that they're being compliant, that they're giving all of their care and empathy labor to men, and that they are, engaging in the kinds of pursuits that women should engage in, right? Being silent, being thrifty, being industrious in the household. And so you follow that path, or you risk being punitively caged. You risk being accused of witchcraft and burned. So that was a very influential book for me. And then more recently, I've been reading Eugenia Sciappara, who has also picked up this Silvia Federici work and has actually started to talk about ways in which online misogyny really is a contemporary analog to the witch hunts. And so what she's arguing is that in this age of technoculture, what we're seeing online misogyny as is a very intentional movement to exclude women from technological wealth creation. And so these are coordinated attacks. They're particularly coordinated against feminists or against anything that sounds like feminism. But essentially what they're trying to do is get rid of all women. It's not about policing our behavior. It's about making sure we are not in that sphere at all. And so for Sciappara, then, it makes sense to think about misogyny as an actual methodology of subjugation. And it also makes sense to her to see this online misogyny as a techno-capitalist form of primitive accumulation, right? So the idea is women are not going to be content creators. Women are not going to be content evaluators. Women, because we are appropriately understood as property and objects, are going to be content online, if at all. And so I find myself actually quite persuaded by Sciappara's view. And so, again, I've been thinking about that in terms of this, what's the background of caging? Why do we do caging? And so I've been working out this idea that I'm calling fetish politics, this way of thinking that quite deliberately reduces women to the status of objects, but objects with malevolent powers. And so again, this, for those of you who might be familiar with the concept of fetish objects in anthropology, that's basically the definition of a fetish object, is that it has these fears and insecurities basically inscribed into it as the powers or the dangers that the object can manifest if you're not good or careful, or a skilled shaman or something like that. So Sciappara notes that social dislocation is a key to these eruptions of gender hatred. So the witch hunts, the online misogyny. These happen in moments where people are uncertain of the social order and their ability to actually effectively function within it. So that's one of the things that will trigger a fetish politics campaign. There's also a normalization that's required, a normalization of women's responsibility for men's well-being. And there needs to be a willingness to talk about and treat women as objects rather than people. And so when you have those things in place, you have this possibility of misogyny, which I think runs under the surface of pretty much all of recorded human history. You see it erupting into a desire to expel women from particular spaces through a process of, first of all, dehumanizing agentic women. So talking about women as objects, and in particular as misbehaving objects, objects that are not staying in their proper places, doing their proper things. And so that dehumanization, that seeing women as objects, is the first and very easy stage because of all of this normalization, these preconditions. There's also then a demonization of women through excessive powers or inappropriate behaviors. So again, thinking back to the case of Jacinda Ardern, you know, she was a woman in charge of a country that was facing a pandemic and needed max vaccinations. So to this day, you can walk around Auckland, where I live, and still see signs and graffiti that basically accuse Jacinda Ardern of 5G conspiracies and trying to microchip us all. And so, you know, that kind of demonization campaign, that breaks down the public support for the woman or the community support for the woman, because she is now doing something wrong, doing something bad. And so that whips up this righteous outrage that then essentially gets turned into mob justice, and a demand that, you know, the woman get thrown out, punished, banished. And what this does, the ultimate goal, I think, of this fetish politics idea, or this fetish politics motivation to cage women, is that it obscures our recognition of online misogyny as a violence, a significant and growing violence against women and girls. And so I think that is the key revelation, I think, for me in the work that we've done so far. I started off talking about this invisibilized intertwining. And I think once you make the links between digital and embodied worlds, once you actually take those links seriously, what you can see is that online misogyny is rhetorical violence that is very deliberately gendered. And if you don't understand it as violence, if you don't understand that it is using words as weapons against women and girls, then what you end up with is something that Miranda Fricker has theorized as hermeneutic injustice. So she has this, I have this sort of quick definition up here on the screen. So epistemic injustice is the kind of injustice that you suffer as a knower in your capacity as someone who is capable of cognition and you know, cognition and rationality. So the hermeneutic in that is about how well you understand or can explain the world you live in. And when you are experiencing a hermeneutic injustice, it is a struggle to name the problem to yourself and others because you lack the social concept. And so the paradigm example that Fricker uses is sexual harassment in the 1960s, right? The concept of sexual harassment didn't actually exist prior to that. Creepy bosses at work existed long beforehand, but it wasn't until that could be named that it actually became something that women could understand is very much not my fault and is wrong, and I shouldn't have to deal with it. And so I think we're very much in the same space now with rhetorical violence that we were in the 1960s with sexual harassment. I think we need to take rhetorical violence seriously as a form of violence, as one of the many violences that exist in our world. So Peace Studies has a really interesting kind of taxonomy of violences: physical violence, cultural and structural violence. I think we also obviously need to build sexual violence into that, but I think we need to take rhetorical violence and really enmesh that into our discussions of violence, because if we don't take words seriously, then we can't really understand the harm of online misogyny. We can't understand the link of the online to the embodied experience. And we won't really have a robust language of harm and injustice that people who are practicing fetish politics can be confronted with until we actually do take these words seriously. So what this has all led up to is my thinking about what our future is going to look like if nothing is done about it. So I think, today we can see in sort of all of these nodes and linkings, we can see women's presence on the internet. This is women as content creators and evaluators, women as agents. We are absolutely present on the internet today. But I think online misogyny, networked online misogyny, is drawing us towards this future in which there will be no women. That we will be content, but there will be no women working on the internet. There will be no women game developers. There will be no women, organizing campaigns to ban under 16s from access to social media, right? There will be, it will be basically male public space. I think that is the end game of online misogyny. So that is my presentation, and thank you very much. I've got some references here that I'll put up just in case any of you are interested in where I got this information from. But yeah, I'm happy to stop sharing now if that's, yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Nicholls. I don't know, Chloe, did you want to start with a question, or do you want us to just open it up?
I could ask a question if no one else has one, but I'm happy to open it up to others first.
Yeah, sorry, I do realize I ran a bit long there, but
no,
trying to get everything in.
We started a few minutes late. You're fine.
Yeah, go ahead, Chloe. Why don't you ask your
okay.
question?
Yeah. I had a question about the glass cage metaphor. I'm not entirely sure. I guess I wanted you to say more about that. In part, like when you talked about it as an expulsion project, it seemed almost like the opposite, like pushing, like I see that as, pushing people out, whereas the cage is keeping people in. And this is, the idea that it's dehumanizing is also something that, I don't know if I should bring this in, but it also often comes up in critical prison studies, discussions of this, that people who are incarcerated often will make the comparison to being dehumanized, that they're being treated like animals, they're being kept in a cage. And then there's been a kind of, Lisa Gunther is a philosopher who wrote a book on solitary confinement, and she has a chapter where she says what's actually happening is de-animalization, and that the idea that being put in a cage is being treated like an animal, it assumes that that's how we should treat animals. So that was the thing that I thought maybe I would talk to you afterwards. It's not really central to your project, but maybe more central is just like explaining like this metaphor, whether it's and I guess you could push people out and then put them in a cage outside. So it could be both expulsion and caging, but anyway, I wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think that's actually a really good question to get at the ways in which I still feel, well, I still feel very much on side with the work that the project is doing, but the fetish politics and the expulsion stuff, this is sort of where my thinking has deviated from this central idea of misogyny as a glass cage, or online misogyny as a glass cage. So I think I'm sort of, I don't want to put myself in the position of trying to justify somebody else's concept, because I'm not entirely, I'm just not entirely comfortable speaking for Suze.
Yeah.
I think
I feel like expulsion works better. So if that's your idea, like I'm with you.
I mean, I think so. It's I think about a micro view and a macro view is I think the best way to explain the different levels of thinking. So Suze is looking at, like, what is the woman's experience? And I think in that sense, the cage works really well, because it does get at that sense of the woman who is being attacked feeling constrained. The people who are looking at her, observing her behavior, going, why isn't she moving? She's free to move. And the people who are sort of seeing the reflected messaging going, oh, okay, if I don't want to be in a cage, I should just keep my head down. Right. So that works really well for looking at the how is this being experienced by the woman. But I think I'm interested in, why are we doing this? Right? Like, what is the point of this? And so I think that's where it starts to look like, okay, the woman in the cage, basically the work she is doing for people who want to get women out of public life is, she is the witch being burned, if you like. Obviously that's a metaphorical thing, but she is the one who is being punished in order to train the others into the good behavior, or in this case, into going, oh my God, the internet is a horrible, dangerous place. Maybe I'll just stay out of it. Right. So I think the cage is basically the gruesome punishment that convinces the rest of us that we just should stay away from the dangerous space. Does that help?
Makes a lot of, yeah, that makes a lot of sense for
Great.
Why both metaphors work. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. Yeah, I think that that's a very important question, right? To really think about, how is this metaphor working, and to what extent can we actually apply it to other, areas of violence against women. So, and thank you, Dr. Nicholls, for your response to that. So we've got a couple questions on the chat here, and then I saw your hand, Talia. Why don't we see if we can get some of the questions, maybe the first couple ones on here.
Okay. Do you want to?
Oh no, it's okay. I'll read him.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
One is from Natalie, who says, so then essentially, if we are online, we are there to be consumed. We have no value to an online misogynist otherwise. And then I'll just read the second one. Perhaps you can answer them together. And the second one is, you describe online misogyny as taking words seriously, but we also have to take images seriously, including how can misuse images of women, tributes, cartoons of violence, etc. So so the first one has to do with, are we online to be consumed?
Yeah.
The second one is about, what about images?
I mean, I think the very depressing short answer to you, Natalie, is that's what online misogynists think we are, is just props, tools, and entertainment. And again, this is, I think, there's a lot of scholarship that's being done these days about the manosphere. And I think this idea that women are just women are there to provide sex and make sandwiches is kind of like core to the incel point of view. And a lot of that networking, that sort of what's been described as a confederacy of online misogynists. I was going to say disgruntled men, but of course, misogynists are not all men. And so there is a sense in which, yes, women exist for men's convenience. And if women are not convenient to men, then we get rid of them. And again, when I say we, that's the online misogynist speaking. That's not me. But yeah, it's actually really quite shocking to read some of these descriptions of what the manosphere, both the men's rights activists, the pickup artists, the incels, there's a variety of them out there. What they think women are is astounding. I read some of this stuff and I'm like, you have a mother, right? You have sisters, maybe, possibly daughters. I mean, that's just like horrifying to me. But yeah, this is little spots in the online world that we live in. And then I'm sorry, the other question, Domale, can you just to give me a little reminder what the second question was?
Second question was, I think you were talking about online misogyny as, and I'm forgetting the word used here, as specific to words, right? The
Oh,
way
right,
we
the
use
images,
words,
yes.
yeah. And so, what about images?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I should go back actually and amend the slide because I'm one of the things the project is doing right now is working on a literature review on online misogyny, and one of our research questions in the literature review is about what kinds of techniques and strategies are being looked at as online misogyny. So, for anyone who's done any work or reading in a violence against women and girls space, the paradigmatic harm that gets talked about or strategy for harm is harassment. So the online the literature review we're doing right now, the data set that I'm working with has 114 articles in it, and probably about 2/3 of them recognize harassment. Like that is sort of the number one most recognized thing that we can do wrong or thing that gets done wrong to women. At least in the online misogyny space. So the growing, surprisingly quickly growing recognized harm or recognized technique of abuse is gendered hate speech and gendered disinformation. And this is really being driven by the sort of the biological essentialism of the internet, or sorry, of the manosphere. This whole idea that women are biologically programmed to want to have sex with hot men and then marry and have children with high income earning men. And these poor incels just can't catch a break because nobody wants them, right? Like there's the great majority of research that's being done online is being done from that perspective. It's centering the poor incels or the poor manosphere. It's foregrounding their understandings of women. And it is vile words, but you're absolutely right to point out that it is vile images too. And I think in particular, the images are doing an awful lot of work in the dehumanizing and demonizing. Right. And in some ways, I think like one of the more shocking images that I saw recently in a presentation by my co-PI, Suze. She did a presentation at Parliament a few months back on this question of Jacinda Ardern and the double bind of leadership. You can be a good woman or you can be a good leader. And so she was basically arguing that, like, Ardern is not practicing masculine leadership. She's not practicing feminine leadership. She's practicing feminist leadership. And so in the course of this presentation, she gave a sort of an overview of, here's some of the editorial cartoons that have come out. And one of them was Ardern dressed as a 16th century witch being dunked in water. And it was a cartoon, and it wasn't even a particularly violent or horrific cartoon. You know, it wasn't as bad as the sort of beat up Anita Sarkeesian stuff that came out in Gamergate. But it was just really shocking to me because it was an image that was being played for laughs. You know, like there was something so trivializing, not just of Ardern, but of violence against women. You know, to present it as a cartoon somehow made it just that much more shocking for me. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work being done in images in, I think, really obvious ways and really subtle ways to just reinforce that women are targets.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you. Thank you so much. Talia, I think you had a question.
Sorry, I think we'd get Zoom after so many years of it. Yeah, thank you, Tracey. It was so interesting. And I see there's some other good comments and questions in the chat, so I'll try to be brief. I guess I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the kind of embodiment. So you talked about the idea, you know, of this experience of online harassment or online misogyny, I should say, online misogyny, as having these, you know, these embodied effects. And you pointed out that sometimes it's sort of minimized because, you know, there's this idea you can just sort of walk away from it. But I didn't really capture if you thought that there was something specific on a kind of level of a hurt, sort of an embodied hurt to misogyny, or that it was simply that it does hurt the way that we live in our bodies, much like, say, other kinds of misogyny. So, you know, I was wondering, and one thing I thought of is I thought of kind of the role of, and then the last example to the role of like shame, and the reproducibility is quite different. The way it would, I mean, there can be shame, of course, in any example of bullying or harassment, but there's something unique about the kind of online way in which it's sort of the shame at people looking at you that you don't see, or something along these lines, or think, you know, that might be, yeah. So
yeah. I mean, I think actually, wow, I really hope this is going to be a coherent answer because I was sort of thinking as you were speaking. So I think there is a sense in which and I think the shame is a helpful thing to grab onto. I think the difference in the way we experience online shame when it is triggered by online attacks versus the shame of an in-person attack. There is an expectation. I think that's maybe the way to grab onto this thought of mine. There's an expectation that we have about online that is you can just put it down, you can just walk away. So there is an expectation that we're not going to take those attacks so seriously, right? They are not going to, an attempt to mobilize us, mobilize shame inside of us through an online attack is going to be, it's almost like we expect it to be less effective. And because we take it that online interaction is more of a chosen thing that we can dip into and then walk away from without any effects. But I think what we're actually finding is exactly the opposite thing, that the shame of an online attack is much, much, much more durable, precisely because nothing ever really leaves the internet, right? I mean, I think about, I made a brief reference in the presentation about my own experiences being bullied as a child in school, or even as a teenager. And I mean, I think that's actually really helpful for me to think about, because like there were a lot of, a lot of the bullying and harassment that I've received has been trying to make me feel really ashamed of myself. And the thing about that is that the incident would happen, and then I'd walk away, and I'd walk away with the effects of it. But it's only now in retrospect that I realized that I also walked away with an unspoken awareness, an unarticulated awareness that that incident was now over. And now all I had to do was pick myself up from it. Whereas I think in online misogyny, like if your Facebook account gets hacked, real life story from one of the politicians that we interviewed, and you have all of a sudden all over your Facebook wall grotesque messages about sexualized things that this person wants to do to you, right? Like, you're a professional woman trying to, get pieces of legislation in, and you wake up and you look at your Facebook page and it's covered in like sexual slurs, right? That's going to stay with you for as long as it takes to get the page cleaned up. And if people have screenshotted it in the meantime, it's going to continue to follow you, right? So there's a weird sense in which we expect online to be ephemeral, and it's turning out to actually be really, really durable. And I think that there's a lot of the work that is, a lot of the harm of online misogyny is taking place in that expectation, that misguided expectation and actual reality. I don't know if that's anywhere near a coherent answer for you, Talia. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right, so we've got two more questions here, if that's okay. And then we can wrap up.
Okay.
So the first one here says, I'm curious about how the discourse changes when we consider racism and online misogyny, misogynoir, in conversation with the glass cage, the fetish objects, and the rhetorical violence.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't get better. So there is a sense in which it's really, really important to acknowledge that, particularly when the women who are being attacked are women of color, so particularly Black women and particularly Muslim women, seem to, I don't think anybody, I don't think anyone who is a woman of color has it easy, but those seem to be the two sort of things that people will really, really hone in on for particular viciousness. And I mean, I think it is a ramping up, of the violence and of the entitlement to decide whether you are a worthwhile person, right? And so it's like it is both the gender and the race being attacked, which basically, I almost want to think about this in terms of deliberately taking away any place for your self-esteem to hide, right? Like if you get attacked as a woman, you can still, I mean, obviously there are very big limitations in my ability to speak for what it feels like for a woman of color to be attacked, but it does seem, at least theoretically, that if you are only attacked as a woman, you can at least sort of take comfort in, or draw strength from, I think is the way I want to say it. You can draw strength from your sort of the aspects of your cultural identity that are your person of color affiliations. But if both of those things are attacked, then where does your self-esteem retreat to? Where do you go for solace? I feel like that doesn't feel like a right way to articulate it, but it does feel like I see that what is happening in misogynoir and other deliberately intersectionally framed hate attacks, misogyny attacks. I do see very clearly that what people are trying to do when they do the intersectional attacks is take away any shred of security, confidence, sense of your own value, sense of your ability to find security in a solidaristic network. Right? It is about carving you out of all of the packs you might be able to belong to. And I do think that we are very aware in the project that in New Zealand, the Black women in New Zealand are Maori and Pacifica. So the indigenous, the Maori who are indigenous to New Zealand, and the Tongan, Samoan, Fijian, Niuean women of the Pacific. And they absolutely do get a much more vicious form of attack, right? It is much more mobilized against them because of their race. It's almost like it's bad enough to be a woman with an opinion, but if you're a woman of color with an opinion, how dare you, right? Like there's just that added sort of sense of insult or outrage, or like that's just not acceptable. And we have a Maori PhD student who when she first came into the project, we were thinking that what she would be doing is looking at sort of how does misogynoir function in a Maori space. Sort of really sort of bringing in some sort of, Aotearoa New Zealand content into the theorizing of misogynoir. And she, I think, has gone in a slightly different direction. For a reason I very much appreciate. She's talked about how we were at one point talking with her about what would be a term that would be specific to the misogyny faced by Maori women. And she did some thinking around that and came back to us with, I'm not going to look for a term like that, because a term like that would acknowledge misogyny. And it's not that she's denying that there is misogynistic relations between Maori men and Maori women, but she was like, misogyny is a colonial concept, and I'm not going to give it a te reo Maori name because that would justify it. I'm like, that's a pretty solid position to hold. Yep, I'll take that. So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of need to think about the particular ways that misogyny impacts women of color. But I think one of the things to think about, certainly when there is a colonization in there also, is that actually there's a real role for the kind of repudiation that Aorangi wants to put in the foreground of her thesis. So yeah, and again, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done considering racism and online misogyny that really is, women like me who do not occupy that subject position need to acknowledge that it exists, but we also need to like get out of the way and facilitate that work being done by the women who actually know what they are talking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholls. We've just got one more question here, and this is from Obi, who is saying, I would like to create a web page or Facebook page talking about these kinds of problems happening in my hometown. Can you give me some tips on that? Since I don't think people from my culture, at least that's what I've noticed in the internet, online misogyny as well as other harassment happen all over the internet. I want to know, where should I start and how can I draw other people who are concerned with the same problem and draw their attention to the problem? And so somebody's trying to start a Facebook group or something online. Yeah. And I just want to start because you did mention one of the tips here that I thought was really, just very poignant. It was when you were talking about getting in touch with these leaders and just put something in their inbox, right? Or, DM them or, post something positive and let them know that you see them and that you appreciate the work that they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that suggestion that I made earlier, the networked affirmation, I think that is a small scale, individual, very, very necessary piece of care labor, right? Each of us can do that. And I think each of us should do that. But I also think, in response to the question about creating a web page or Facebook page, I really feel like I need to be like I need to start a response by being very clear that these kinds of web pages and Facebook pages are targets. Like, you are potentially opening yourself up to a lot of abuse just because you have chosen to name the issue. And again, anyone who's familiar with Sarah Ahmed's discussion of the feminist killjoy is, once you name the problem, you become the problem, and people will turn on you. And so, like, one of the particularly galling things for a lot of the women we've interviewed is, these are smart, switched on, brave women, and a lot of them have not hesitated to name the online misogyny and call it out when they get it. But what they've found is that just massively upcycles the volume of the abuse that they get. So talking about online misogyny is potentially making yourself a target. And I think, I'm not saying that the web page or Facebook page shouldn't be done, but it should be done thoughtfully and carefully. And if you're going to do it, I think it would be really good to talk to somebody who's familiar, somebody who is aware of or has worked in a violence against women's space. Because I feel like you will need support in setting up something like that and maintaining something like that. And what I mean by support is that kind of care labor of like, yes, this is important work. In terms of like doing that web page or Facebook page in order to bring people's attention to the problem, I wonder to what extent there are creative ways to bring attention to the problem that don't bring the ramped up attacks with them. So I think that one of the things that happens in online attacks, trying to think from the standpoint of the attacker, I don't want to absolve them of responsibility for some of the absolutely vile and horrific things they are willing to say to people they don't know. But I do think that there are people who really do think, oh, this is just me and my keyboard. I'm just being an abrasive presence. I'm being, the Socratic gadfly or something like that. And I think that's a very disingenuous way to perceive yourself if you are engaged in online misogyny. But I think what you want to do is, if this is a project that you're interested in, maybe something to think about is how to get through that. Oh, I'm just having fun online, just being cheeky. How you get to someone and really get them to see the harm of that. And I think maybe, something like, would you say that to your daughter? Right? I mean, I don't know, maybe you would, in which case, wow, that conversation, I'm at the end of that conversation. But yeah, so I think you do need to be very, very careful about keeping yourself safe and about um, being realistic in the kind of reaction that you can expect. So I really hope I didn't just crush that project, because I love the idea of each of us kind of doing the little bit that we can. But I do think you need to be very careful when you wade into this space.
That was our last question. Thank you so, so much, Dr. Nicholls. Thank you, Chloe. And special thank you to Dr. Talia Welsh, who's our department chair here and has been so supportive of the Feminist Research Speaker Series. And thank you all for being here.